The first hint looked like a mistake. A soft bruise on a sonar screen, the kind of smudge you see when the sea floor changes texture, or when a school of fish drifts through at just the wrong moment. The survey team marked it anyway, because that is what disciplined people do when they are tired and still trying to act sharp. A dot, a timestamp, a coordinate, a note that said the return was too clean to ignore. By that evening, the dot had a second dot beside it, then a third. The vessel running the survey was not hunting ghosts. It was mapping a proposed route for new cable, one of those unglamorous jobs that pays on time and never trends online. Yet the data kept stacking into a shape that did not belong on a natural bottom. Long, symmetrical, hollow sounding on the high frequency, the kind of object that throws back a tight signature, then disappears when you change the angle, as if it is trying to hide in the sand. The chief tech slowed the boat, adjusted the towfish altitude, and ran another pass. The smudge sharpened into a silhouette, a spine, a bow-like curve, a dark cavity where a deck should have been. He wrote one more note, more careful this time. Man-made, possible wreck, length consistent with a small commercial ship. Nobody cheered, nobody joked about buried treasure. Everyone on that deck had seen enough to know that a wreck is never just a wreck. It is paperwork, liability, and sometimes a name that still hurts a family. The location was not far from a busy corridor, but it sat in a pocket of water that ships rarely crossed unless they had a reason. The current there did odd things, the kind of lateral push that drifts objects off expected tracks. That alone could explain why nothing had been found earlier. It could also explain something darker, the kind of luck that feels like intent only after the fact. The survey company sent the coordinates to the appropriate authorities. That was routine. What was not routine was the response that came back within a day. A missing vessel had been logged in that general region years ago. Not a famous case, not a headline machine, but a persistent bruise in the records. A coastal community story, the kind people still bring up when the conversation goes quiet. A boat that never came in. A captain who was too competent to vanish without leaving a trace. A distress call that had never made sense. The name of the missing vessel sat in a binder in an office that smelled like old coffee and sea damp. The binder had been pulled often enough that the spine was soft. A supervisor read the note from the survey team, then turned to the page that had been photocopied so many times the ink looked gray. The St. Arlen, a small shipping vessel used for short runs between ports, hauling parts and provisions, sometimes mail, sometimes equipment that nobody wanted to store in town. Privately owned, not rich, not poor. The kind of ship that survives on reliability and the stubbornness of its crew. It disappeared on a night that everyone remembered for the weather. The official file said, deteriorating conditions, probable mechanical failure, possible capsizing. It also said no debris field, no oil sheen, no confirmed radio traffic beyond a brief burst that never repeated. It said the search ran until the math stopped making sense. It said presumed lost at sea. The file did not say what the locals said. Locals rarely write in binders. Locals said the St. Arlene had been carrying something unusual that week, something that made the owner nervous and made the captain quiet. They said 2 men had visited the dock that afternoon, men who did not look like they belonged to any shipping company anyone in town had ever heard of. They said there was an argument on the pier. They said the ship left later than it should have, like it had been delayed on purpose. None of that held up in a formal review. It never does when all you have is memory and tone. The supervisor contacted a unit that specialized in underwater recovery and investigation. That unit did not treat a sonar silhouette as proof, but they treated it as a reason to begin the slow, careful process that people on land rarely imagine. There would be planning, there would be coordination, there would be a check of currents, tides, seasonal visibility, and the way the bottom behaved in that pocket. There would be a line in a budget spreadsheet. There would be a risk review that described drowning in clinical words, and then there would be time in the water where none of the clinical words matter. The first deployment was not diverse. It was a remotely operated vehicle, a compact machine with lights that cut the dark like a narrow promise. The ROV descended through a layer where sunlight fades into a cold green. The camera feed showed drifting particles that looked like snow in a blackout. Then the bottom rose into view, rippled sand, scattered rock, a sparse garden of sea growth. The wreck appeared at the edge of the frame and made everyone in the control van go quiet. It lay on its side, half sunk, half exposed. The hull was scarred by corrosion and abrasion, but the outline still held. It had not been pulverized by a violent impact. It had not been torn apart by a rock shelf. It looked like it had been placed there gently enough that the sea had time to claim it in layers. The ROV drifted closer. A railing, twisted but recognizable. A section of deck plating bent inward. The nameplate was not readable, but the design matched the St. Arlen file photos enough to make the supervisor's jaw tighten. They did a slow orbit. They looked for breaches, for openings, for evidence that the ship had imploded under pressure or been ripped open by something heavy. They found a gap along what used to be the starboard side, a wound that could be impact damage or something else. They found the cargo hatch partially ajar but warped, frozen in place by years underwater. The ROV light swept across a rectangular door on the upper side, half buried in silt. The radio room entrance. The door was shut. Not just shut, it looked secured. Hinges intact, edges tight. A thin line of marine growth around the frame, like the sea had been sealing it for a long time. The supervisor leaned forward. The tech piloting the ROV angled the camera down. There was something on the door handle area. Not a padlock, not a chain. A metal latch assembly, corroded but still in place, as if someone had wanted that room to stay closed no matter what the ocean did to the rest of the ship. That detail changed the tone of the operation. Wrecks open themselves over time. Water finds a way. Pressure works on seams. Yet here was a compartment that looked intentionally preserved. They scheduled a dive. The divers were not thrill seekers. They were professionals with routines drilled into muscle. They suited up with the kind of calm that comes from knowing panic is lethal. The briefings covered entanglement hazards, silt-out conditions, structural instability. They talked about the possibility of air pockets and toxic gases. They talked about the fact that even a small mistake becomes a problem that consumes everyone. They descended on a line, each movement deliberate, bubbles rising in a steady stream. The wreck grew out of the dark and made the divers look small. Up close, corrosion had eaten at bolts and seams. Marine life had made homes in corners. The hull felt like an old bone. The lead diver reached the radio room door and paused, hovering, as if waiting for the ship to give permission. He ran a gloved hand near the frame. The seal line was thick with growth, but the metal beneath looked less degraded than it should have. That suggested something unexpected. It suggested the room behind the door had remained relatively dry for longer than the rest of the vessel. It suggested trapped air. Trapped air in a sealed room underwater is not a gift. It is pressure, instability, and the kind of unknown that makes smart people move slow. They set a camera on a small mount and ran a line, a reference that could guide them back if the silt turned the world to nothing. The lead diver then worked the latch assembly with a tool, careful not to wrench it and send a vibration through a weakened structure. The latch resisted, then gave. The door did not swing open, not at first. It held, as if suctioned. The diver eased it, a fraction at a time, letting pressure equalize. A thin puff of trapped gas escaped and rolled upward, silver in the dive lights. The door opened enough to show darkness inside. A clean darkness, not full of drifting silt. And that was another clue. The lead diver angled his light into the gap. The beam hit a wall, then reflected off something flat, pale, and rectangular. Paper. Paper does not belong underwater. His pulse spiked even though he had trained for surprises. He widened the opening and pushed his head and shoulders into the doorway, keeping his fins outside to avoid stirring silt. His light revealed a scene that looked like a still photograph. A desk tilted but intact, a radio console bolted to the bulkhead, a shelf with binders, a mug that still sat upright as if someone had placed it there and stepped away. And on the desk, a logbook, not dissolved, not swollen into pulp. A logbook with pages that looked crisp, edges sharp, cover intact. The water inside the room looked minimal, a low pool in one corner held there by the ship's tilt. The lead diver moved closer. The logbook was open as if someone had been using it. The ink on the page looked dark, not ghosted, not washed into a blur, dark and readable. He signaled to the second diver. The second diver entered, slower, eyes fixed on the desk like he was afraid to breathe. He brought a sealed evidence bag designed for wet environments, a flexible container that could be closed and tagged underwater. They filmed the desk from multiple angles. They filmed the book in place. They filmed the surrounding objects, the radio console, the shelf. They did not touch anything until they had a record. In underwater recovery, the camera becomes your memory, because people on land will question everything you say you saw. When the lead diver finally lifted the logbook, it did not disintegrate. It had weight. The cover flexed like ordinary board. The pages turned cleanly. He felt a prickle of cold that had nothing to do with the sea temperature. This was wrong. It was too intact, too alive. They sealed it in the evidence bag with the water from the room, keeping the environment stable. They tagged it with time, location, and diver identification. They began a systematic sweep of the radio room, not hunting for drama, hunting for context. There were other papers, a manifest binder, a maintenance notebook, a stack of folded charts. Most were in better condition than they had any right to be. The room had been a capsule. On the ascent, the lead diver kept the evidence bag close to his chest, protecting it like it could vanish. The second diver watched their line, watched the wreck, watched the way the dark seemed to push in from the corners. Back on deck, the evidence was handed over without ceremony. Chain of custody began immediately. Gloves changed, bags documented, seals inspected. The supervisor watched every step because she had learned the hard way that the weakest part of any case is not the ocean. It is human sloppiness. The logbook went into a controlled container, temperature moderated, humidity monitored. A conservator was contacted, someone who understood paper and ink the way a mechanic understands engines. The investigators did not open it again until the conservator arrived, because the fastest way to destroy something delicate is to satisfy your own curiosity. That night, nobody slept well. The next morning, the conservator sat at a table under bright, honest lights. She inspected the book through the clear evidence bag first, looking for mold, water damage, ink run. Her expression stayed flat, professional. Then she paused, leaned closer, and her flat expression tightened into something else. The ink. It looked recent. Not just dark, but glossy in the way ink can remain when it has not been fully cured for long. The paper fibers around the strokes were clean. No feathering, no spread into damp texture. She asked for a small sample of the water inside the bag. That water was tested for salinity and contaminants. It came back with a mix consistent with seawater that had been trapped, but it also showed something unusual, a lower biological load than expected, as if the room had been sealed enough to slow the normal growth cycle. The conservator opened the bag in a containment hood and lifted the book with tools designed to minimize stress. She fanned a few pages. They moved like pages in a book you might find in an office drawer, not a book that had spent years underwater. She placed it under magnification. She examined the ink line edges. Then she looked at the paper. The paper had a watermark, not a fancy one, but a manufacturer stamp pressed faintly into the fibers. She photographed it and handed the image to the investigation team. The stamp identified a mill still operating. That part alone did not prove anything, because mills can run for decades, and stock can sit in warehouses. But the conservator's tone told the team what she believed. This book did not look old enough to have been on the St. Arlene the night it vanished. The investigators opened the logbook carefully and began reading from the first relevant entry, documenting every page with high-resolution scans. The writing style was plain, practical, the kind of entries captains make when they believe the only audience is themselves and maybe an insurance adjuster. Weather notes, engine sound, cargo checks, crew details, nothing dramatic. Then the entries shifted. There was a section that described unusual radio interference, another that described a light on the water that did not behave like navigation lights, another that described a change in course made for reasons that felt like unease more than navigation. The handwriting stayed steady, not frantic. That steadiness made the content more unsettling, because fear, written with calm, suggests someone trying hard not to lose control. The log described the night of the disappearance. The time references were not in digits. They were written as phrases, like just after midnight, like near the end of the watch. The captain described a sudden mechanical issue, a jolt through the hull, then a loss of power that was not total, more like a partial collapse that left systems unreliable. He described an attempt to raise help over the radio. He described static, then a brief contact that felt wrong, like someone answering without the expected protocol. There was no name given for the answering party, just a note that the voice pattern did not match the local operators. The captain wrote that he did not trust it. The entry ended with a line that felt like a decision. The captain wrote that he would secure the radio room, keep the log safe, and move to address something on deck. Then the next page began with an entry that should not exist. It described morning light. It described the sea calming faster than expected. It described the ship drifting, damaged but not sunk. It described the crew missing, not dead, missing. The captain wrote that he was alone on his own vessel. He wrote that he had searched the compartments. He wrote that he had found signs of hurried movement, a torn glove, a smear of something dark on a railing. He wrote that he had tried the radio again and heard nothing but a repeating burst that sounded like a loop. He wrote that he believed someone had boarded during the outage. He wrote that he believed the cargo was the reason. Then again, the log did something that made the room feel colder. There were entries for additional days. Short, focused, written like someone rationing words because the paper had become precious. The captain wrote about trying to repair what he could. He wrote about rationing water. He wrote about hearing a small boat near the hull at night and seeing lights that never came close enough to identify. He wrote about voices carried over water, then silence. He wrote about the fear of leaving the ship, because leaving meant stepping into darkness with no guarantee of rescue. Then he wrote about a visitor. The visitor was not described as a rescuer. The visitor was described as someone who knew the ship, someone who knew where things were stored, someone who moved through the vessel with a confidence that did not match a stranger. The captain wrote that the visitor did not speak much. He wrote that the visitor inspected the cargo area, then returned to the radio room. He wrote that the visitor looked at the logbook, and here the handwriting changed. Not completely, just enough for the conservator to mark it as a different hand. A new entry began, written in a cleaner script, less functional, more deliberate. It stated that the ship would not be found. It stated that the captain would not be believed. It stated that the sea would take care of the rest. The entry ended with a note about sealing the radio room and leaving the log where it could be recovered if someone ever opened the door. The investigators sat with that page for a long time. A missing vessel file had just become something else. Not an accident, not a simple storm story. It now read like a controlled disappearance, with an unknown person involved. Someone who came aboard after the initial event and made decisions about what would remain. The supervisor did not let the team spiral into theories. She kept them on procedure. First, verify the logbook authenticity. Second, determine when it was written. Third, match the handwriting, the ink chemistry, the paper source. Fourth, align the narrative with known facts from the original case. Fifth, identify the cargo and the people who had access to it. They began with the cargo. The old manifest in the radio room was legible. It listed ordinary items, but also one category described with vague language, equipment, sealed units for industrial customer. The customer name was present, but it was a shell entity, a company that looked legitimate until you pushed into the registration data. The investigators pulled maritime records, they pulled port logs, they pulled customs declarations, they pulled insurance documents, they built a timeline. The St. Arlen had been loaded by a subcontractor 2 days before departure. The subcontractor was no longer in business. The owner of that subcontractor had moved out of state years ago. One of the workers listed on payroll had died. Another could not be located. The investigators tracked the shell entity and found it had been used for short bursts of activity, then allowed to go dormant. It had listed an address that led to a rented mailbox. It had paid its fees through an accounting service that served hundreds of clients. At first it felt like a dead end. Then the team looked at what else had been happening in the region around the time the St. Arlen vanished. Not weather, not shipping, crime. There had been a series of seizures of illegal goods in nearby ports. Nothing big enough to make national news, but enough to concern the right people. There had been rumors of a group using small commercial vessels to move contraband. There had been a case involving a corrupt port employee. That employee had been charged, then the case had weakened unexpectedly. The supervisor circled the name of the port employee and stared at it until her eyes hurt, because that employee had been on shift the day the St. Arlen loaded cargo. The investigators requested archived security footage from the port. Most of it was gone, overwritten long ago. But a private warehouse on the industrial side had kept its own footage longer for insurance reasons. That warehouse had been a storage point for the subcontractor. The footage was poor and grainy, but it showed the loading dock that afternoon. They watched forklifts move crates. They watched workers carry paperwork. They watched a man in a jacket step into frame and point at a pallet as if he owned the air around him. He was not the subcontractor owner. He was not the captain. He was someone else. The investigators enhanced what they could. They pulled still images. They ran them through databases, not expecting a miracle. The miracle arrived in a boring form. A partial match. Not definitive, but enough to trigger a secondary review. The man resembled a person connected to an old case in another state, a case involving maritime theft and an assault that had never been fully prosecuted because witnesses backed out. The man had a history of working around docks, then vanishing when attention increased. The investigators put a name to him: Ezra Mallon. Ezra Mallon was not a ship owner, not a captain, not a sailor in any formal sense. He was a fixer, a man who knew how to make things happen without leaving clean paperwork. He had disappeared from records for years. The supervisor asked a different question, and it was the right one. Who had recently bought a ship logbook from a supply store, the kind used on small commercial vessels? The conservator's watermark image helped narrow down possible suppliers because different regions carried different stock. The investigators contacted the manufacturer. The manufacturer provided a distribution list. The list included a small maritime supply shop within driving distance of the port where the St. Arlen had last loaded. The shop owner was cooperative but cautious, the way someone becomes after seeing enough trouble stroll in wearing a smile. The owner did not remember every customer, but he remembered unusual ones. He remembered men who paid in cash and asked odd questions. He remembered someone who wanted an older style logbook, something that looked like the kind captains used years ago. The owner said that customer had been in recently, within the last few months. That fact hit like a wave. The St. Arlen had been missing for years. The wreck had been underwater, sealed and quiet. Yet someone had purchased a logbook in the old style recently, as if preparing to place it somewhere. The team's theory shifted again, hard and fast. The logbook might not be a relic, it might be bait. Someone might have been on the wreck recently, not a ghost story, a human story. The supervisor expanded the operation. They brought in divers trained not just in recovery, but in forensic work. They planned a second dive, this time to search for recent disturbance, tool marks, signs of entry, anything that could indicate modern activity. They also requested data from maritime traffic systems. Even small boats can leave traces if they use certain equipment. They requested local marina records. They requested fuel purchase logs. They asked for boat ramp camera footage in the area, the kind that catches license plates when people launch at night. The second dive began with higher tension. The sea was calm, but calm can be deceptive. Calm makes people careless. The divers returned to the wreck and approached the radio room door. They filmed the latch assembly. They noticed tool marks that had not been emphasized the first time because everyone had been focused on the miracle of paper. The marks did not look like corrosion. They looked like recent scratches where a tool had bitten into metal. They traced those scratches with a gloved finger, then filmed them close. They moved along the hull and found another clue. A line had been tied to a section of railing. Not an old line turned into fuzz by years underwater, but a modern synthetic fiber, still bright beneath a thin coat of algae. It had been cut, not broken. They followed the line to where it disappeared into silt. They excavated carefully, using gentle jets to avoid destroying context. Under the silt, they found a small anchor, the kind used by recreational divers to stabilize position. That anchor did not belong to the St. Arlen. It belonged to someone who had visited the wreck. The divers continued, documenting everything. They found more modern items: a cable tie, a piece of tape, a fragment of a plastic bottle label. These were not conclusive by themselves. The sea carries trash everywhere. But together, near the radio room, and near a point where someone could stabilize a small boat above, they began to look like a pattern. Someone had been working here. The divers entered the radio room again and examined the desk area more closely. Under the desk, tucked behind a panel, they found a second item that rewired the case. A waterproof container, modern, sealed. Not a relic, not old nautical gear. A container designed for someone who expected water, expected time, and expected discovery. They brought it up under the same controlled chain. They did not open it on deck. They did not open it in the van. They opened it in a lab where the air smelled like disinfectant and patience. Inside was a small handheld radio, the kind used on boats. It still had power. It still had a charge. It had been packaged with desiccant packs and sealed as if someone intended it to work later. There was also a memory card sealed in a secondary sleeve. The lab technicians imaged the card. They copied it without altering the original. They reviewed the contents. It contained audio files. The supervisor shut down any impulse to listen casually. Audio can become spectacle. Spectacle destroys cases. They treated it as evidence, logged it, and sent it to a specialist. The specialist listened, then reported the important thing. The audio did not match the years-old disappearance timeline. The environmental noise in the background, the radio traffic patterns, and a short segment of weather broadcast indicated it was recent, within the last year. On the audio, a person described approaching the wreck. The person described opening the radio room. The person described placing a book. The person also described something else, something that made the room feel suddenly small. The person described that the wreck was not empty, not in the supernatural sense, in the human sense. The audio suggested that someone had been using the wreck as a storage site, a cache, a place to hold items temporarily away from eyes. The investigators stopped thinking about the old case as an isolated disappearance. They began thinking about it as a platform that modern criminals might exploit because it was already forgotten. The next step was boring and brutal. Find who had been visiting. The supervisor requested marina guest logs for the past year, focusing on small boats capable of night runs. She requested fuel dock surveillance clips. She requested sales records for specialized diving gas mixes. She requested permits for salvage diving in the region. Many divers operate without permits, but the ones who want to look legitimate sometimes leave trails. The trails appeared in a place nobody romanticizes, a small dive shop 2 towns over. The shop had sold a set of accessories that matched items recovered near the wreck. Cable ties of the same brand, a compact anchor of the same type, desiccant packs in the same packaging. Not proof, but a thread. The shop owner provided receipts. The receipts led to a customer account. The account belonged to a man who had been a familiar face in the local diving community. His name was Nolan Pierce. Nolan Pierce was not a teenager chasing thrills. He was experienced. He had done salvage work. He had a reputation for taking jobs that others avoided. He was known for being calm, almost dull, which is exactly the kind of person who slips past suspicion until something cracks. The investigators looked at Nolan Pierce's history. He had a prior violation for unauthorized salvage in a protected area. Nothing that would keep him in prison, but enough to show he did not always respect boundaries. He also had financial trouble, the kind that makes people rationalize choices they would once have rejected. They pulled his boat registration, they pulled his docking slips, they pulled his phone location data with proper legal process because they were not building a story, they were building a case. The phone data placed him near the wreck area on multiple nights over recent months. Then the supervisor did something that felt almost unfair, but fairness is not the goal of investigation. The goal is truth, supported by evidence. She compared Nolan Pierce's handwriting to the second handwriting in the logbook. The match was not perfect at first glance, but certain shapes repeated. The slant, the way the writer crossed letters, the pressure pattern at the end of words. A forensic document examiner was brought in. The examiner did not guess. The examiner measured stroke width, pen angle, habitual formations. The examiner concluded there was a strong likelihood that Nolan Pierce wrote the second set of entries. That conclusion made Nolan Pierce the most important person in the case. Not necessarily the murderer, not necessarily the original boarder from years ago, but someone who had inserted himself into the story. Someone who had tried to control what would be found. Why would a diver do that? The answer arrived from a different angle, the way answers often do. A detective working on a separate case contacted the supervisor. The detective had been investigating a string of high-value thefts involving maritime equipment. Items vanished from yards, then appeared months later in different states with altered serial numbers. The detective had a suspect name that kept popping up around those deals. Ezra Mallon. The old fixer had not vanished. He had shifted. The supervisor and the detective shared information. The detective provided recent surveillance images from an unrelated operation. One image showed Ezra Mallon meeting a man at a boat ramp late at night. The man was Nolan Pierce. The case now had a modern spine. Nolan Pierce was working with Ezra Mallon. The wreck of the St. Arlen was being used as a stash point. The planted logbook and the sealed container were part of a system designed to mislead or to create leverage, or both. But the original disappearance still needed resolution. What happened to the St. Arlen crew years ago? The planted logbook contained a narrative of missing crew and a visitor. That narrative could be fiction designed to confuse. Yet the wreck itself might still hold evidence in compartments that had not been disturbed. The supervisor ordered a methodical search of the vessel, focused on spaces that could preserve remains or objects, sealed cabins, storage lockers, engine room corners, any cavity that might have trapped items away from currents. The divers began that search with grim focus. They moved slowly, filming, clearing silt carefully, labeling every item with position and context. In a compartment near the cargo area, behind warped metal, they found something that had been hidden intentionally. A bundle wrapped in heavy plastic secured with tape, weighted down. They brought it up. In the lab, the bundle revealed personal effects: a wallet, a watch, a ring, items that do not float away by accident when a ship sinks, items that someone removes from bodies then packs together. That discovery squeezed the room. It turned speculation into something heavier. The investigators ran the personal effects through missing persons databases and family records. The ring matched a description provided years ago by a spouse who had insisted, over and over, that her husband would never abandon his ship. The supervisor arranged notification through the proper channels. She did not enjoy it. Nobody normal enjoys it. The team continued the search. In a corner of the crew quarters, behind a collapsed panel, they found a second bundle. More personal effects. A set of keys. A small pocket notebook. A photograph softened by time but still visible. The notebook contained a few lines of handwriting, not a logbook entry but a personal note. The ink was old. The paper was water damaged. It felt like it belonged to the original event, not the recent intrusion. The note described fear and confusion. It referenced two men boarding during the outage. It referenced the cargo. It referenced being forced to the deck. The note ended abruptly. No dramatic flourish, just silence on paper. Now the investigation split into two linked tracks: the modern criminal use of the wreck and the old disappearance that appeared to involve violence and theft. The supervisor assembled a timeline that made sense without needing magic. The St. Arlen suffered an engineered outage or sabotage. During that vulnerability, two men boarded, likely from a small craft. They controlled the crew, removed whatever cargo they wanted, then eliminated witnesses. They did not need to sink the ship immediately. They only needed to ensure it would not return. The vessel drifted, damaged, then eventually went down in a place that made searching difficult. Years later, Ezra Mallon and Nolan Pierce discovered the wreck, likely through diver rumors or their own scanning. They recognized its value as a hidden storage site. They also recognized that if authorities ever found it, attention could reveal their modern operations, so they attempted to control the story. A planted logbook with fresh pages, a staged narrative, a sealed container with recent audio that could direct investigators away from the real stash compartments. It was clever, in a cold way. It was not clever enough. With the evidence stacked, the investigators moved to arrests. They did not rush. They waited until warrants were airtight, until surveillance confirmed patterns, until they could hit multiple locations and seize equipment before anything could be destroyed. Nolan Pierce was arrested at his home early in the morning. His boat was seized. His dive gear was cataloged. His computer devices were imaged. His storage unit was opened with legal authority. Inside the storage unit, investigators found items linked to the theft ring. Maritime electronics, tools, sealed cases, serial numbers shaved down. They also found something that tied directly back to the St. Arlen. A small collection of personal items that belonged to the crew, including a pocket watch, engraved with initials that matched the missing captain. That pocket watch had not been recovered from the wreck. It had been taken years ago and kept as a souvenir or leverage. Either way, it was a bridge between the original event and the modern suspect. Ezra Mallon proved harder to catch. Fixers tend to move when pressure rises, but pressure rose quickly. Authorities tracked his contacts, monitored known associates, and watched for patterns at ramps and marinas. He was arrested while attempting to depart from a private dock using a borrowed boat. He carried a small bag. In that bag were documents, cash, and a set of keys that matched a padlocked storage container at a marina. Those keys would have been a footnote in many cases. Here, every footnote mattered. The storage container held more equipment, more stolen goods, and a ledger. The ledger was not poetic. It was a list of transactions, coded but consistent. The investigators decoded it through repetition and context, comparing it to known theft reports. The ledger also contained a line that referenced the St. Arlen by a nickname used in the local diving community. The old wreck had become inventory. In court, the case did not rely on one dramatic piece of evidence. It relied on a web that held under pressure: sonar discovery, ROV footage, diver documentation, chain of custody, forensic paper analysis, ink chemistry, water analysis, tool mark comparisons, purchase receipts from the supply shop, phone location data, handwriting evaluation, recovered personal effects, seized stolen goods, and the ledger. The planted logbook became a centerpiece, not because it was supernatural, but because it revealed intent. Someone had wanted to shape what investigators believed. That is a confession in behavior, even when a person refuses to speak. The supervisor sat through testimony that felt like a slow grind of facts, because that is what justice often looks like. Not a cinematic moment, more like a machine turning one tooth at a time. The families of the missing crew received answers in fragments. Some wanted more, some wanted less. There's no right amount of truth when grief has been waiting for years. The wreck of the St. Arlen remained on the bottom after the operation, marked and monitored. It was now a documented site, no longer a hidden pocket, no longer a convenient secret. It had been turned from a weapon into evidence, from a rumor into a record. Months later, the maritime supply shop owner told an investigator something that stayed with the team long after the headlines faded. The owner said Nolan Pierce had asked for the older style logbook with a strange kind of precision. Not just any logbook. He wanted one that looked like it belonged to a different era, as if he expected someone to open it and feel time collapse. That detail explained the cruelty in the choice. It was not only about hiding a modern crime. It was about stealing the narrative of the dead, about turning a real disappearance into a stage where criminals could perform control. The sea helps people like that. It erases, it blurs, it makes everything look like bad luck. But sometimes the sea also returns things. Not gently, not quickly, just enough in its own slow calendar to put a bruise on a sonar screen that a tired tech decides to mark anyway. And that is how the St. Arlen finally surfaced, not into sunlight, but into a chain of evidence strong enough to hold